Hello once again, and great to have you with us on the Planet stage at COGX Hybrid Festival 2021. Please feel free to tweet any thoughts or questions you have on any of the sessions. You can tweet us at @COGX_festival or use the hashtag COGX2021. Given that this is a hybrid virtual conference, many of you will be joining remotely. This allows us to do things just a little bit differently. So if you want to go for a walk and take us with you, please feel free. If you could, you can also take us to the gym. It's probably not a good idea to listen while operating heavy machinery, but at least we can't be held responsible if you do. Whichever way you choose to listen, buckle up, fasten your mental seatbelts, and prepare yourself for a whirlwind of exciting and informative sessions. Our next session now dives into the fight against deforestation. Deforestation is arguably one of the hardest but most important decarbonisation challenges we face and requires collaboration across multiple sectors and jurisdictions. This session looks at the new campaign that the UK government launched as part of the COP26 process to accelerate action on deforestation. This conversation is being moderated by David Saddington, the head of the COP26 Nature campaign in the COP26 unit. David, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. Absolute pleasure to be here this morning with you. Absolutely right. And yeah, we'll be talking around ramping up the fight against deforestation. Today, a few months ago, as COP26 Presidents, we launched the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue, the FACT Dialogue, and this is to tackle deforestation and the preservation of those critical carbon sinks on land by transitioning from damaging to sustainable land use. And this is recognizing that the majority of forest loss around the world can be linked to agriculture, particularly globally traded agricultural commodities, which such as palm oil, soy, cocoa, beef, pulp and paper, for example. And already the FACT Dialogue has convened 28 of the largest importers and exporters of those commodities to agree a common pathway to sustainable action. And by COP26 in this November, we hope to have that agreement. It's co-chaired by Indonesia. It is backed by the G7 this weekend and also supported by the Tropical Forest Alliance to make sure business voices are included. And we do think this is historic and potentially really game-changing for the next decades. So to now dive into expanding on sort of how we get those 10 years right, which is of course the theme for COGX. I am very pleased to be joined today by Morgan Gillespie, the Global Director for Forest and Land Use Coalition at the World Resources Institute, Stephen Jamieson, the Global Head of Circular Economy at SAP, and Isabella Granero, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Senior Associate at Partnerships for Forest, who joins us from the Brazilian countryside today. So I will turn to each of you one by one and ask you, what does a great COP26 look like in terms of ramping up the fight against deforestation? Morgan, I'll come to you first.
Thank you so much. I mean, for us, one of the biggest outcomes that we're hoping for at COP this year is really an increased ambition from a number of nation states to reaffirm their commitment to protect and to restore nature. There's a lot of events taking place this year, lots of folks calling it the super year, with the UN Food Systems Summit, with the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming in October, and then culminating with COP26. And we want to see an interlinkage of the outcomes from these events, really culminating in as I said, a reaffirmation of commitment and action from countries around the world to protect and to restore nature.
Thanks, Morgan. Stephen?
Well, of course, building on that great start there, I think from our point of view, it's really about recognizing the role that technology and insights have in terms of how we can drive transparency and really help businesses to be able to embed these sort of regulations and the sort of policy changes that are needed in order to be able to drive this sort of impact. So really bringing those two pieces together and creating that kind of global consensus so that we can see this change happen at scale and sustainably in a way that will last.
And finally, Isabella.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. So yeah, I think COP26 is a crucial moment for the governments to enforce their NDC commitments, to really renew the commitment to the planet and make accountable for the actions taken so far and what has been done, what will be done for the next 5-year cycle. I think engaging with companies to make them accountable for their supply chains and productive systems, inform the society of their impacts. As COP brings the whole planet together and this perception of union that we have. So it's everyone's responsibility to co-create a livable future.
Thanks all. And I think maybe just diving into that point, which was just raised there around sort of food systems, we're talking, what we're talking about here. Let's de-jargonize this. We're talking about sort of food. We're talking about things which we all eat, which are globally traded. So Morgan, I might come to you first. So just, why is making food systems more sustainable? You mentioned around sort of the super year for nature. Of course, there is the UN summit on the UN Secretary General summit on food this year as well. So can you maybe tell us a little bit around sort of why is tackling this so important for you?
Yeah, so the food and land use question, where I lead a coalition of institutions and countries, we really focus on driving transformation of the food and land use systems. And you ask a great question, why? Well, I think most people know, right? The world is really facing a triple crisis right now. There's growing inequality, we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the ongoing climate crisis. Now, a fair and sustainable recovery to this pandemic will address inequality as well as the climate crisis, but a key area of action and investment must be in the food and land use systems. It's responsible for a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So as we think about the broader COP or the UNFCCC framing, where the NDCs and the Paris Agreement are really focused on driving down GHG emissions so that we can achieve a 1.5 degree world, you can't get to 1.5 degrees without tackling the food and land use system, because as I said, they're really responsible for a quarter of the existing emissions on the planet. But broader than that, food and land use systems are also a source of income and employment for 500 million smallholder farming households around the world. And just 2 minutes on sort of why smallholder farmers, these smallholder farmers provide much of the food that the world consumes, but often they live in conditions of great poverty and vulnerability. And that vulnerability we're seeing increasing as a result of the climate crisis. So the situation really needs to change if the world wants to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we all want to do that. If we want to achieve our Paris Agreement climate targets, and if we want to address our global biodiversity goals. You already mentioned that it's the production of these commodities, right? These soft commodities, palm oil, beef, soy, paper, and pulp. These are really still the primary drivers of tropical deforestation, but these commodities also underpin the global food production system and the global consumer economy. They sustain the livelihoods of not only the farmers that are creating these commodities, but us, right? The people that consume them, as well as the key industries along the way. So really driving change within the food and land use systems is critical for people and for planet, and addressing the smallholder farmers is a really key area of focus to spark that transformation that we're seeking to achieve.
Thanks, Morgan. You put it so eloquently. And I think when we were discussing before, I think it was about 93% of our co-chair country, Indonesia, are sort of smallholder farmers we discussed. So, it is so important to do that. Isabella, I might turn to you. Do you have any reflections on what Morgan said there? Any sort of reflections from the ground in Latin America?
Yeah, so I think the main issue here is for us to be accountable. How can we be accountable for the deforestation? And I see that transparency of data is a key issue that we can really come to accomplish this. And we've been facing some challenges here in Latin America regarding data transparency. So to really go and tackle the deforestation and really get to people that are really making this to happen. So yeah, that's what I would say for now. Thanks.
That issue of data is so important, though, isn't it? In actually making this real, because of course, without sort of trusted, verifiable data, we don't actually know whether we're making an impact or not. And I know, there's been so many deforestation. If we are actually making a difference, Stephen, from your perspective, in the world of data, you're so immersed in this. What's your perspective on this? How do we actually sort of know if we are making a difference?
So I think this comes down to taking a holistic approach and looking at this topic globally and across every market. And I think there are some reality of data and the way businesses use and consume data over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been about it's looked within the sort of the four walls of that organization and hasn't necessarily looked at the full due diligence right back to the ultimate land use impact. And I think one of the opportunities we now have with the sorts of technologies that we've got to our disposal from mobile technology in the ultimate sort of hands of people in the farming communities, but also technologies like blockchain. We're starting to innovate things now which allow you to trace commodities, whether they've come from sort of undeniably sort of good sources, so to speak, whether they're sort of okay or arguably undeniably negative, coming from deforested land, for example. I mean, able to trace these things using chain of custody solutions that can help really get that sort of transparency right through a complex supply chain. And it's going to be a combination of different sorts of technologies that come together, backed by enabled by clear regulation that is going to provide us the tools we need. And so I think the opportunity is there for us to drive this sort of transparency. The question is whether we can align the stakeholders and the communities at the global level in order to be able to go and deliver this effectively and quickly.
Absolutely, that alignment of stakeholders is so important there, which you mentioned, of course. Transparency and traceability is one of the key topics, which the FACT dialogue was 28 governments are diving into. Isabella, I know you've worked on blockchain, so I wondered whether you've got any sort of reflection on what Stephen just said there. Do you think it is a promising solution? Of course, it's such a sort of buzzword at the moment. I'm sure will be mentioned many, many times in COGEX.
Yeah, so I think that blockchain is one of the possible solutions that we have. There's still a long way to go. There are some challenges that blockchain faces, such as making it more free from greenhouse gases and make it more sustainable. But at the same time, I see it as a promising technology to really have the traceability that we can have on for example, the beef supply chain, on monitoring the various actors that we have. So I see like the technology as a means to tackle deforestation, but I'd like to make the point that the technology for itself is not going to solve the problem of deforestation. We have to engage the actors, and we have to make it usable for those who are really in the problem.
Making sure that technology is accessible to all, as Morgan was saying, around sort of the importance of smallholders in this discussion as well. Morgan, I wonder if you had any reflections.
Well, I think it's really interesting because this, we're talking on transparency and traceability, but we're also talking about data for business, but we're also talking about due diligence and how to get there. And I want to bring in, obviously I'm sitting based in London, and there are a huge number of leaders, or 7 really big leaders in the UK right now at the G7. And I think it's important to note that the G7's climate and environment communique actually commits G7 nations to, and I quote, enhancing supply chain traceability and transparency, and if appropriate, to develop regulatory frameworks or policies, which may include the introduction of due diligence requirements. And I just want to make kind of a strong play for these due diligence requirements to actually take shape. And I think the FACT dialogue could potentially have a role in that, right? If all G7 nations enacted due diligence legislation, this would cover a major share of the global commodities market. It would be really instrumental. And if it was done well, due diligence really is a means of establishing a genuine partnership between producer and consumer countries like Brazil, countries like Indonesia, in which consumer countries really commit to respecting the laws and the standards of those producer countries and to work with them to support a transition, and again, with my smallholder hat on, to farming practices that are sustainable in the long term, right? So these partnerships could ultimately lead to more prosperous rural economies around the world, in which smallholder farmers could really flourish and be more fairly rewarded by the global markets for the adoption of sustainable practices. So you get all of these really impressive co-benefits, right? improvements to rural livelihoods, improvements to smallholder farming, improvements to long-term sustainable production through this one mechanism, which is globally enacted due diligence, which is an opportunity, right? This is an opportunity that we could really capture now through the UK's leadership of the G7 and through the UK's leadership of the FACT dialogues.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to expand on that for people who aren't sort of as familiar with what's happening at the moment in terms of that space, the UK currently, is being debated in an environment bill at the moment, introducing due diligence legislation to make it a legal requirement for companies to make sure that they are only importing legally produced commodities such as palm oil, soy, beef, for example. And of course, we see that as a key lever in terms of tackling deforestation, and absolutely, Morgan, as you said, making sure we have that alignment between what we are doing as importers and what is happening with those super important forest exporters is so important. And Stephen, Isabella, you both mentioned alignment when you were talking on sort of technology. What's your sort of hope for due diligence there? Do you think this will sort of help?
So I think from our point of view, I think due diligence absolutely has an absolutely critical role in terms of how businesses can be, I guess, held to account in terms of how they're sourcing products and so forth. But from our point of view, there's really a few kind of key enabling sort of spheres that need to be brought together here, both in terms of how we're sort of enabling that transparency and that due diligence to happen. But to kind of support in the previous comment, how we actually create those connections, sort of moving away from the sort of traditional sort of sourcing models through the very largest producers and the very largest sort of supply chains, but also just helping to enable the small holdings, the smaller producers who are able to provide offerings perhaps more locally, but aren't necessarily able to find marketplaces for those offerings. So how we can leverage the vast sort of procurement technologies, the network technologies that producers are already using in order to be able to source materials, but then connecting those directly into the more sort of smaller freeholders. And we're actually running a number of pilots at the moment. We've got one called 5 by 5 by 25, which leverages our procurement technologies and our procurement network in order to be able to positively incentivize, social sourcing, for example. So if you're running a direct procurement activity, you can check a checkbox and make sure that you're only sourcing through certain sort of socially qualified value chains for a particular circumstance. And then the third thing is just about how we help influence consumer behavior more generally and help to drive that conversation in the material space, making sure that we're really helping to drive the transition from products that are consumed to products that are used, and helping switch those business models and providing business the sort of the incentive in order to be able to do things in a way that is ultimately more protective of society overall. So it's really bringing together those sort of three spheres of helping get transparency along with connectivity and bringing these communities together and along with helping sort of transition the shift and enable the transitioning of the shift.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question on that, Stephen. What is that driver for business? Why are so many businesses engaging with you at the moment? Because of course, SAP works with so many businesses around the world. You're so ubiquitous in terms of that data question. What do you think is actually driving businesses to get serious around sort of interrogating their supply chain traceability at the moment? Is it consumer pressure? Is it the raw sort of economics of this? It's seen as a risk. What actually do you think is promoting this real surge?
I think what's happened in the last 18, 24 months is a sort of an alignment of planets in some way, in the sense that we've now got a situation where we have a high degree of consumer pressure and consumer awareness, along with a sort of political appetite to drive change, although you can debate that, along with technology ability in order to be able to solve some of these problems, and now business and investor alignment behind tackling these challenges. And I think this alignment is now starting to kind of click into place, and also alongside that, some really competent activities happening in the kind of the NGO community to really kind of raise the game and to drive the right sorts of questions for everybody. And so I think this sort of alignment of factors is really helping to stimulate this shift now. And for example, a lot of conversations we're having at the moment are around things like, the next generation of extended producer responsibility regulations, the financial implications of that, and how to, I guess it's the disruptive forces that are kind of global, consistent, and are creating a level playing field. And these are the ones that people are really reacting to now. Alongside, I would say, CEO commitments. Where we've been running a survey with 7,500 of our largest customers, and actually it's the CEO commitments which are actually driving a lot of these activities moreover than some of the cost-driven factors now, which I think is an interesting indicator as to how appetite is really sort of driving in the right direction, certainly as far as we're seeing it.
Absolutely, and of course that action from business is so important, because the fact dialogue, as I said at the start, primarily is a government to government dialogue, making sure that we are aligning what governments of those importer and exporter countries are doing. But of course, we can't achieve this decade of shift to really ramp up the efforts to tackle deforestation without the role of the private sector. So we are supported by the Tropical Forest Alliance, who is making sure that voice is heard in the conversation. But Isabella, Partnerships for Forest is all about making sure the governments work with businesses and actually making some of those models to keep the forest still standing economically viable. So I wondered whether you had any reflections on that in terms of how to get the businesses and governments aligned and working together.
We have three main pillars at Partnerships for Forests. And one of them is focused directly on business. The second them is on enabling conditions, so taking the barriers out for the business to thrive. And we also have the demand side measures, so working on the demand side for those standing forests, for example, products or the NTFPs that we have. And we have been having a lot of impact delivered with these partnerships along with the government, and we want to keep doing that all the way until the end of the program.
Fantastic. Morgan, you've worked in so many places around the world on this. What's your sort of, we've heard from Latin America, but you worked in sort of Asia, Africa.
I think it's really, I was reflecting actually as I was listening to Stephen's response that, one of the key changes that happened with the Paris Agreement, right, was the rise of the non-state actor. In previous COP processes, it was really government to government, and it's the inclusion of the private sector, of businesses, and increasingly of financial institutions that I think has really sparked this increased ambition and drive to change. It's the recognition that we have to take a holistic, systemic view of how the world is working together, that yes, policy and regulation is one half of the equation, but the other half of the equation is financial incentives, is understanding how we can transform businesses to enable profitability in a new era with new sustainable business models. In the private sector, we talk about, what are the drivers of business action, and it's usually reputational risk, regulatory risk, financial markets risk, and how can you elevate, as an NGO, I can say, how do we elevate those risks to spark action from the private sector? And it's been, maybe the silver lining, if you can say that, from the COVID crisis, that people really understand that the increased risk of zoonotic disease, of these pandemics, are really driven by our continued encroachment of not living in harmony with nature. And so I think, the time is now to bring all of these different elements together, as Stephen so eloquently put, to say, okay, businesses are ready, financial institutions are ready, governments are ready, and the science is clear, right? We have a decade to do this, or we're really going to not be in a great shape. And there's the willingness and the motivation to make it happen. So I'm feeling, from my experiences on the ground, probably more optimistic. There's more signs of hope. There's some worrying signs too. Let's be fair about that. But I'm probably feeling more optimistic that we should hope to have some high-level outcomes this year that will really spur action for the next decade.
I'm feeling optimistic as well from working on the fact that I've seen many sort of COPs through the years as well, and I agree with your reflections on the private sector really stepping up from Paris onwards. But maybe if we the optimism is sort of fantastic, but of course, we need those sort of, those very specific steps, immediately to actually sort of turn this problem around, because, what we're talking about in terms of tackling deforestation has been trailed for decades. Actually, the problem is still getting worse. So, we have so many entrepreneurs, innovators, people listening on the line at the wonderful sort of COGEX festival today. What would be your message to them? What particular challenges do you think, this community can help overcome in this space? What does need to be done by this community within the next few years? Any takers?
I'm not sure if it's directly answering your question, but it's one reflection on that point of the optimism and the positivity. And I guess one of the challenges that certainly I see day to day, which is, we talk to thousands of producing businesses day in, day out. And, what is true is that there's some fantastic work happening. There's some real leadership happening. There's some, entrepreneurs, business leaders that are really kind of grabbing this by the scruff of the neck and running with it. There's also a lot where that's not happening so much. And so I think there's a sort of let's be realistic about the role and opportunity that business can bring. Yes, certain actors will step up to the plate, but will enough actors step up to the plate at the same time in order to really drive the sort of impact that's actually necessary? I think that's a question we don't necessarily know the answer to. And I think alongside that is just, the nature of business is that, the organization may well find an incredibly innovative way to solve a particular problem, a way to sort of solve a way to solve transparency around land use impact. There's no consensus as to how we should do this yet. Each business is sort of innovated its own route at the moment. And with that comes risk, because what's happening is we're getting a situation potentially where, you might have a number of organizations that have got a very good view in terms of what they're doing. And as long as they're okay, then what's the issue? But if you take them out the market and then we look at the others who aren't necessarily doing some of those things, we potentially haven't solved any problems at all at scale. We've really just taken out a slice from a few different producers. So I think it's how you kind of get this sort of marry the innovation that needs to happen with the consistency and approach that's necessary in order to be able to ensure that impact happens at the kind of the scale and the pace that's necessary on a global level.
Absolutely, and I think your point there. What I sort of take away in particular is how do we make sure sustainable agricultural sustainable agricultural commodities aren't a niche product. With what we're talking about here, what we're trying to do with the fact dialogue is, of course, is to have an entire market shift from damaging to sustainable ways of producing and trading these commodities. And that is the scale of the challenge we need to actually tackle this. So it's not sort of going to be easy, but a huge amount of sort of great work and absolutely the alignment, I think, which we are seeing sort of now, which has never been seen before, of actually government, business, civil society sort of really sort of aligning around this. So hopefully the fact dialogue COP26, we can really build that momentum this year. This set us up for a strong decade ahead. Morgan, Isabella, any reflections on what you think the COGEX community can do to help with this global challenge?
Yeah, I think two things. So first off, 2021 is a big year, right? For climate, for food, for nature. But I think it's important to recognize there's no one silver bullet for what success will look like. We know that business as usual is no longer an option if we want to deliver this transformation that we need. We know that we need this profound systemic change. And in order to achieve that, we need all of the players within the system: businesses, financial institutions, governments, farmers, citizens. They all have an active role to play, not only this year, but beyond. In terms of really tangible actions for business, the easiest thing to do is to get involved, right? So if you are a business owner, you work in a business, you have to understand what's your impact. That's the first question you should be asking yourself, and thinking about tropical deforestation as a lens of which to assess that impact is a really interesting first place to start. A lot of people focus just on these commodities and are like, I don't deal with these commodities, therefore tropical deforestation, I don't impact it. But tropical deforestation goes beyond these commodities. Think about the R&D needed in chemicals and pharmaceuticals company. Think about rubber. Think about, broader aspects. Think about freshwater security and biodiversity. All of these things come together. So for a business, I would say, understand your impact. You can't manage what you don't measure. So figure out your impact, start measuring it, and then you can take actionable steps to reducing that impact over time. And yes, supply chain is part and parcel to that, but figure out what's going on in your own four walls, and then think beyond your supply chain, and then think beyond the landscapes in which you're working. We know we need collaborative action. We know we need efforts made at jurisdictional levels. We know that companies need to come together in pre-competitive spaces to work collaboratively to solve some of these problems. I think the cool thing about working in the space right now is the sky's really the limit, right? Innovation and blue sky thinking is really helpful. And there's a lot of experts out there that can support businesses. So understand your impact, take actions to reduce it, and don't be afraid to reach out to those who can help.
Nicely put, Morgan. And on that topic of innovation, I might just do a quick sort of plug for some very exciting news which is coming from the World Economic Forum very, very soon. They will be launching an uplink competition, which will be a global innovation challenge, exactly on this topic of conversation around ramping up the fight against deforestation. So do keep your eyes peeled for that one. We are wrapping up on this, so I might give the final words to Isabella. Any final reflections from you from Brazil? And of course, being one of the most, we talk about protecting tropical forests, and of course, Brazil and the Amazon basin, of course, captures the public imagination for many of the right, but also sort of wrong reasons as well. But any final reflections from you from your work in Brazil?
Yes, thanks, David. I would say that we have technology nowadays to understand where the deforestation is happening, so we can make accountable and make responsible for those that are having these practices, so we can go after the problem and to solve this. So I'm very optimistic on this side. I see that we still have a lot of challenges to really have the administrative sanctions that we need for those who deforest. But at the same time, I see that the civil society is more than ever engaged on this matter, and we have to do this for the humanity, and it's now or never. So I see that this COP26 is very crucial for us to get there, and this fact dialogue is really interesting to have the lessons learned around the globe to make the efforts that we need to really tackle deforestation and keep the planet under 1.5 degrees. So thanks.
Nice. So much optimism today on the panel, which is a lovely way to start a Monday. But thank you so much for joining us, Morgan, Stephen, Isabella. Really pleasure to host this conversation this morning. And for those watching, please do stay tuned to this space. Follow the COP26 Twitter handle for more information on the fact dialogue. You can also check out the Tropical Forest Alliance. If you are a business, you can sign up to their network there and engage in the process. And of course, as we count down the weeks to Glasgow, there will be opportunities to participate in the conference itself. Hugely oversubscribed in the nature space in terms of people wanting to exhibit there. But over the coming weeks, we will be working with those who are successful. I'm sure there will be opportunities for those who are unsuccessful as well, in order to have their voice heard in that conversation, whether it be around sort of fact and deforestation or the broader nature work which we're doing around sustainable land use, agriculture, and of course oceans, which will be part of Nature Day. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much to our panelists, and back to you, Pete.
Thank you, David, for moderating this session, and thank you, Stephen, Morgan, and Isabella for such an interesting and important conversation. It really feels like there is a window of opportunity opening to make real progress and action on deforestation. I was really struck by Stephen's point that we now have a culmination of pressure being brought to bear, pressure from consumers, pressure from leaders of countries with large demand for forest-related commodities, CEOs stepping up, investor activism on forestry, and we have the technology capability to radically improve transparency. Just a reminder that you can tweet out any thoughts or questions following this session at @COGX_festival or use the hashtag COGX2021. The next session will start at 12 noon and we'll look at how economics, science and tech can combine to unlock nature's value. Lucy Armand from Nature for Climate will be joining us to introduce this session. So stick around, we are just getting started.